before I wrote Start With Why, I discovered this idea, this concept of the golden circle, where we all know what we do, the jobs we have, the things we do. Everybody knows. In fact, that's how we introduce ourselves. I'm an epidemiologist, I work in travel. Like, that's literally how we introduce ourselves, by what we do. Some of us can say how we do it, the things that we think distinguish us or make us better in whatever it is we do. But very, very few of us can clearly articulate why we do what we do. I don't mean to make money. I don't mean to accomplish, some sort of status. I mean, literally, what's your purpose? What's your cause? What's your belief? Why did you get out of bed this morning, and why should anyone care? And most of us cannot answer that question. And what I learned was, based on the principles of how the brain makes decisions, the limbic brain versus the neocortex, which is the most inspiring leaders, the most inspiring organizations, those that seem to have an unbalanced capacity for, let's call it, movement building. Mm-hmm. Every single one of them thinks, acts, and communicates the same way, and they all start with why. The rest of us start with what? You sit on a plane and somebody says, what do? You answer that question. They don't. They tell you what they believe. And it speaks directly to that limbic part of the brain that is what controls all of our feelings and all of our behavior, but not our rational, analytical thoughts or language, which is why it's hard to put these things into words. So when I discovered that, I decided to do an experiment on myself, which is, there are two principles that are religion for me. One is starting with why, and the other one is something called the law of diffusion of innovations, which was a principle that a guy by the name of Emmett Rogers wrote about in the 50s or the 60s. And what the law of diffusion says is that all populations, regardless of their size, sift across the standard deviation, the bell curve, right? If you have high performers, you're going to have low performers, you're going to have an average. Always, always, always. What the law of diffusion says is the first 2.5% of any population are your innovators, your Steve Jobses, your Elon Musks, big idea people, right? The next 12.5%, 13.5% of your population are your early adopters. These people are willing to expend more energy, time, money to be a part of something that reflects their own beliefs. They'll stand in line for 24 hours to see, opening day of Star Wars new movie, where you could just go 2 weeks later, walk in and buy a ticket, and but for them it's worth it, right? To sacrifice, to feel a part of something bigger than themselves. Then you have the early majority, the late majority, more cynical, more practical. What's in it for me? If it goes wrong, will I get my money back? Will I get in trouble? And then you have your laggards, the last 16%. The only reason they make any kind of adjustments is because they have no choice anymore. What the law of diffusion says is that we are all looking for mass market success or mass market acceptance of an idea. And so what we usually do is we aim all of our intentions into the middle, into the mass. Most marketing is for the mass. But it doesn't actually work that way. Remember, that majority is cynical and practical and doubtful. And the way you actually do it is you aim at the early adopters, and you achieve 15 to 18% market penetration, and then a social phenomenon happens called a tipping point, and it just goes. And the reason is because the early majority will not try something until somebody else has tried it first. Low risk tolerance, right? Now, if you ignore this entirely, you'll always get about 10%. And we all know about these 10% because the way we talk about them is, I love that guy, he gets it. Oh, that guy's an idiot, he doesn't get it. Get what? That's what we're talking about. It's this magical thing. And so when I learned about this, I realized that the way you talk to the early adopters is by starting with why. Because you're speaking to that deeply, deeply emotional part of the brain that makes them want to act. And so I decided to do an experiment. And it was with my own career. I was going to prove that these principles work. So I got really good at starting with why, and I got really good at only working with early adopters. And so I was living hand to fist, like I had no money, and I needed every gig I could get to pay my bills, and yet the discipline to say no to people who weren't early adopters ran high. So now I get accused, you're like, oh, you can afford to say no to business. And like, I've been doing this a long time. So for example, I remember early in my career, I was preaching this stuff, and a guy had heard about me through, the entrepreneurial network. He got my phone number, he calls me up, he says, I've heard good things about you, convince me why I should hire you. Which immediately says to me, not an early adopter, and I literally said, don't. Because anybody who says, convince me, this is not going to work. I'll get you eventually, but I'm not going to start with you. Where the ones I said yes to were the ones who said, I can't afford you, I can pay you a little bit, but I don't think you've got everything right. I think you've got some things wrong, but you're onto something. And so I didn't care about the money, and I didn't care about whether they fully agreed with me or not. It's that they were open to something new and different, and those ones I said yes to entirely. Start with why. People think that it's the TED Talk that made the book sell. It's not what happened. By sheer coincidence, the book and the TED Talk came out at the same time, and they did not grow at the same rate. I've never had a marketing company. I've never done any advertising. I've never been on national television except for recently. My book has never been reviewed by any major newspaper because I wanted to prove I didn't need those things. I didn't game the system of Amazon. Most authors know how to game the Amazon system to pop themselves up to an Amazon #1 bestseller. It's just an algorithm. You can game the algorithm. You can even hire companies to make you a New York Times bestseller. I won't tell you some of the authors that do it because I know who they are, but it happens. I wanted to prove the theories and the principles of starting with why and the law of diffusion. And so I treated my own idea as a social movement to prove that these principles 100% worked. So it was done with no money, no mass media. It was all word of mouth. And the way word of mouth works is when an early adopter finds something that helps them reflect themselves, who they are, they tell their friends. And what's more trusting than a recommendation from a friend?